Okay, thank you everybody for your patience, and thank you for joining today's webinar on the hidden costs of pension reforms, rising income inequality, lagging economic growth. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm NCPERS Executive Director. Today's program is part of our Center for Online Learning, which provides remote continuing education to public pension trustees, staff, and other fiduciaries and stakeholders. Today's webinar will cover NCPER's latest research on publications that delve into, our latest research publication that delves into the crucial connection between access to pensions, income inequality, and economic growth. Leading us in today's webinar are Dr. Michael Kahn, NCPER's Research Director, and Dr. Josh Bivens, Chief Economist with the Economic Policy Institute, or EPI. We encourage audience participation. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function on the Zoom platform. Your questions will be answered near the end of the session. With that, Michael, Josh, let me turn the webinar over to you.
Thank you, Hank. I think I'll go first, and then I'll turn it over to Josh. So could you go to the next slide, please? Thank you so much, also our audience, and thank you for your interest to join us today. I also want to thank my reviewers, including Robert Kuttner at Brandeis University, Teresa Gilarducci at New School for Social Research, Keith Brainerd, National Association of State Retirement Administrators. They provided a lot of good feedback and very constructive feedback as I was doing the study and the analysis. Next, please. So the purpose of our study is overarching goal is to make policymakers and stakeholders aware of the changes. What's the impact of changes that are being made to public pension plans or pension plans overall in the country? So we look at the national level where main change has been shift from defined benefit pension plans to defined contribution plans such as 401k type plans. And at state and local level, most of you already are familiar with it. Over the last 20 years or so, states have increased employee contributions, cut benefits, closed pension plans to new hires, and converted DB plans to DC plans in some places. Next, please. And our study examines basically two questions as Hank laid out. Do these so-called pension reforms increase income inequality? And does rising income inequality in turn dampens or slows down the economy? And actually, apart from my own analysis, Josh is going to expand on this relationship between rising income inequality and economic growth. Next, please. So the answer to both of these questions is yes. Obviously, the key social consequence of pension changes is rising income inequality. Next, please. So, why should we really care about rising income inequality? And I wanted to share with you this flow chart, and you begin with rising income inequality and follow the arrow around. The next thing, what happens is power concentrates in the hands of few people, and then those with powerful influence influence the policy in their own favor, which results in polarization and dysfunctional government and threat to democracy. I mean, before you, somehow I feel we are heading in that kind of direction anyways, because of this situation. Next, please. And Chuck Collins, who wrote a book, Apartheid in America, a while back, he called this phenomena wheel of misfortune. So I think that's why we should care about rising income inequality. Next, please. So apart from this social and this wheel of misfortune, rising income inequality slows down the economy, and that's very important for us as pension funds who invest and seek for, and if the economy goes down, the returns go down also. Next, please. So looking back historically, next, please. Income inequality in the United States was low during the 1950s through 1970s. This was a period during which our tax system was progressive, when we made adequate investments in education, labor unions were strong, and pensions were prevalent. So that was the good period. And starting in 1980, tax and economic policies made a U-turn. Next. And so some people believe that, regressive taxation, which really means cutting taxes at the top, the weakening of workers' right to organize, undermining pension, privatization, or underfunding public education is probably good for the economy or good for profits. Next, please. So the literature shows, my study, I have reviewed a lot of literature on all of these items from studies done by various people. So the literature shows that progressive taxation, regressive taxation, weakening workers' right to organize, lack of investment in education, pension reform that undermine pensions, contributes to rising income inequality. Next, please. And literature also shows that rising income inequality dampens economic growth. Next, please. So, and I also mentioned that, it's common sense that when economy slows, return on investments also go down. So as a pension fund advocates and pension trustees, income inequality is not really good because it slows down the economy and slows down the returns on investments. Next, please. So I could have just stopped because there's a lot of literature proving what we want to say using data. As researchers, we are sort of nerds and want to go through do it ourselves, not believe others. The others say yes, yes, that's true, but I think you want to do your own. So what I have done is using data from various public sources. We examine the relationship between pension changes, income inequality, and economic growth. And of course, in the context of other variables that also impact income inequality. So you can isolate the impact of pensions from other variables that also contribute to increasing income inequality. Next, please. So we'll examine these trends and relationships at national level as well as at state level. So next, please. So this is a visual picture of the trends between 1977 and 2021. And we talked about, the regressive taxation actually contributes to income inequality. The top line in this chart is the taxation, regressive taxation, which I mentioned in 1980. We used to have 70% marginal income tax. Marginal income tax means the highest income earners pay. That's the tax for them. If you are a billionaire or whatever, the highest income tax. So it was used to be 70%. In 2021 is about 36, 37%. So it came down. So the trend is each of these variable has two lines. One is the actual plot going up and down zigzag, and the other is just the slope. So you can see visually it's going down. So the more regressive the tax system, the top line going down, the income inequality line is the bottom line. And you can see that's the only line trending upwards. From 7 to 14, the ratio, income inequality we measure by looking at the ratio between top income quintile to the bottom income quintile. So it moved from 7 to 14 over this period. So all the other variables also I mentioned, participation, labor union, participation in DB plan, everything going down, membership in and investment in education. So all those four lines, four factors that we look at going downward, income inequality going upward. So that's sort of the whole, but sometimes there are too many lines, you can't tell. But so we look, next slide, please. We look at the correlations between these variables, and you can see that they're pretty robust between regressive taxation and income inequality. The correlation coefficient is minus 0.68. That's pretty robust. Same thing for decline in union membership, decline in share of workforce in DB plan, lack of investment in education. All these are moving in the opposite direction. Inverse relationship means if one goes up, the other one goes down, the other goes up. So these variables are going down. As we saw in the previous chart, the income inequality going up. Next, please. And if you recall, the next question was, so rising income inequality, does it slow down the economy? So here we have a chart, visuals showing for the US national level, income inequality up, the top line, and the two ways we look at economic growth is the annual growth in median income and the annual growth in MFP. MFP means multi-factor productivity, which takes into account the labor, capital, and raw materials, so everything included. And you can see that the trend, the slopes are going income inequality going up, slope of median income going down, and the MFP also going down. But, charts are zigzag and hard to read. So the next slide, please. So we look at the correlation between these variables and income inequality, and they have also minus sign, although it's not as robust, but it's pretty significant. Negative correlation mean if so inverse correlation, one goes down, the other goes up, so that's what the minus signs means. And I mentioned that if economy goes up, markets usually go up, usually, and if economy goes down, the markets and returns go down too. And here is just a visual picture of S&P Dow annual growth rate and the economic growth. Again, the swings are bigger in the market, but the direction is pretty much the same, and you can see the relationship in the next chart. Next, please. In the next slide, and you can see they move in the same direction. There's not a minus sign. So if the Dow Jones, if the economy goes up, the Dow Jones go up. If the economy goes up, the S&P goes in. So they move in the same direction. And if one goes down, the other goes down too. So it's not inverse, but it's a sort of same direction. Next, please. Then we look at, do a multivariate analysis. This is at state level. All 50 states as the unit of analysis is state. There in the previous section, we were looking at national level where unit of analysis is year. So we're looking over time. But this one is looking at 50 states over time as well from 2000 to 2020. So here, negative pension changes actually impact increase the income inequalities. So these are the strengths of the beta values, which mean how much change would occur. So with one negative pension change, you increase income inequality by 0.27. So a part of the ratio. Income inequality is measured as a ratio between the top and the bottom quintile. So if this was going to be 1, it will be 1.27. For each negative pension change, your income inequality increases with that much. So similarly, lack of investment in education, regressive taxation has the highest value. Next, please. And the second question that we addressed throughout is does income inequality slows down the economy? So here, income inequality actually higher it has a negative sign. That means sort of inverse. So if income inequality rises by 1 unit, like the ratio increases by 1, the economy slows down by about 2%. So that's very significant findings. So we are controlling for actually even the investment in education here. So given all that, changes, negative changes really impact income inequality, slows down the economy. So in short, the answer to those two questions basically are prevailing pension reforms exacerbate income inequality, and rising income inequality in turn drags the economy down. I'm going to skip the next 2 slides. Next. Okay, that's good. So I want a good transition. I had actually contacted Tom Piketty. He's well known for his work on income inequality. And from his recent book, Capital and Ideology, he was giving a lecture at London School of Economics. So I borrowed a slide from his presentation. And here you can see in this slide, the green line is the economic growth, and red line is the income inequality. So from 1870 all the way to 2020, this is for United States. So let's look at the last part from let's say 80 or so onward, the red line going up, income inequality shooting straight up, and the economic growth green line going down. So that's really a good place to stop. And next, please. Next slide. So I'm going to turn over to Dr. Bevins to go ahead. And actually, his work I reviewed in my study also, and I was very impressed how he captured why rising income inequality actually slows down the economy. So that's really a great, thank you so much. With that, turn over to Josh.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Hopefully that's going to be the one. Hopefully you all can see a title slide, and I will get started. Okay, thank you so much. And thank you for the organizers for the chance to present this. as the title says, what I'm going to talk about is the channels through which rising inequality can reduce overall growth. And I'm really going to focus on one channel in particular, inequality's effect on growth of aggregate demand, which is basically just the combined spending in the economy by households, businesses, and governments. And then I'm going to talk about the importance of this aggregate demand channel through which higher inequality reduces growth, how much it's affected the economy in the past, what we think the effect is sort of right now in the economy, and then some very rough forecasts for what it might mean for the future. I will say I'm going to, before going into the aggregate demand channel, I will just one quick detour. This is just one channel through which inequality can affect growth. I think there are many channels through which inequality can be, honestly, mostly a bad thing for growth. The sort of third bullet here, the what I call kind of the malign supply side effects of inequality on growth. Basically, the idea is if you think growth depends a lot on the quality of your workforce and human capital, and I think most research says it matters a lot, and if you think there's a lot of potential quality and very productive people in the bottom half of the income distribution, but if they are being underinvested in throughout their young lives, then maybe that potential is never realized, and maybe you've just squandered really large parts of what could be a very potential workforce because the inequality of resources don't allow enough investments in sort of that bottom half. And just, one graph I think is really striking on this. This is just spending on children's enrichment activities by families in the top income quintile versus families in the bottom. And enrichment expenditures, like the note says, it's basically high quality childcare, summer camps, private schooling, tutoring, computers, books. I think the really sort of striking thing here is actually as a share of income, families in the bottom quintile have increased their spending on enrichment activities more than families in the top quintile, but that dollar gap between them has just widened enormously over time because income inequality has channeled so much more money to families in the top. And so this is just one example of the supply side effects of inequality could be really large if we think there will be real gains to investing more in children in the bottom quintile. But just pitching back to what is going to be the main thrust of this talk, which is the aggregate demand channel, the intuition is relatively easy, and it's just these 3 bullet points. One, rising income inequality just means income is being transferred higher up the income distribution, more and more income accruing at the top. Households higher up the income distribution happen to save a much higher share of their income than households in the bottom, which intuitively I think makes a lot of sense to us. If you're living paycheck to paycheck, there's very little money to be saved. If you're extremely wealthy, you've got a lot of money to save. Your income is far in excess of your current consumption needs. And if you combine these two things, a big transfer of total income going to a group of households that saves more money, that means overall savings rates should be higher, and hence household spending should be lower as a result of this income inequality. And if we think aggregate demand is just the combined spending of households, governments, and businesses, this big drag on household spending that occurs from transferring so much money to higher saving households should be important. And so just some thoughts on how true and empirically important is this intuition going to be. My argument is going to be in the past. There's a lot of evidence this has been very important. Like for the past 30 years before the pandemic, there's evidence that growth in the US economy is very demand constrained. Some people have called this secular stagnation. There's clear evidence there's been a big upward redistribution of income. There's a very large gap in savings rates between high income households and the rest. And so all of these combination of things means that there's been a very important aggregate demand slowdown caused by this upward redistribution. I think for the present, like at this moment in the US economy in the couple of years after the pandemic, the very large fiscal push from the American Rescue Plan actually moved us out of this zone of demand-constrained growth for a couple of years. We've seen inflation and interest rates both move up significantly, so evidence that we're demand-constrained is sort of not so high at the moment. And then in the future, I'll just say a couple words at the end. But going through some of the facts, this one is just some evidence that lagging aggregate demand is actually a constraint on economic growth. And what we have here is basically a measure of actual GDP relative to potential GDP. And if that potential GDP is just that dashed horizontal line at 1, that is actually an estimate by groups like the Congressional Budget Office about what the economy could produce if economies were, or if resources were near fully utilized, if inflation was stuck at sort of the natural rate of unemployment, if factories were fully utilized, all of that. And you can see, like in the late 1990s, actual GDP was either at or above for short periods of time, that potential. That means unemployment was very low, resources were fully utilized. And so that there was little evidence, like in that year particularly, that growth was demand constrained. Since then, you've seen actual GDP lagging far below those estimates of potential GDP. This is some evidence that the growth is demand constrained. This compares shares of income before taxes and benefits between 1979 and 2018, just to demonstrate the very large upward redistribution of income over this time. It's a little bit of a messy graph. I'd urge you maybe just look at those 2 very light blue blocks on the ends that are the top 1%, and the rest of the top 5%, the 96th to 99th percentile. And if you add those together, you basically see almost 10% of total income has been transferred from the bottom 90% to the top 5% over those 2 periods. And so this is a very substantial upward redistribution of income that has happened over this time period. And then the question becomes, as you transfer money from like the middle 60% or the bottom 80% to the really sort of small sliver at the top, what does that do for overall savings rates in the economy? How big are the gaps in average savings rates depending on income level? And it turns out they're just absolutely enormous. Basically, if you look at the top 5th of families by income in the United States, their savings rates are close to 13%. If you look in the middle, they're much closer to like 3%. And if you look at the top 1%, which has been the group that has seen by far the biggest increase in their share of total income, just the top 1% share of total income by itself has risen by 7.5 percentage points between 1979 and 2019. They have about a 31% savings rates. And so there's a huge gap in savings rates. So income transferred from the bottom or middle to the top is going to see a very large share of that being saved rather than spent because of that transfer. The combination of these 2 things, the upward redistribution and then the gap in savings rates, if you just multiply the 2 together, you can get a sense of how much lower household spending is because of that redistribution to higher saving, hence lower spending households. And I basically do that sort of calculation, and I basically take 1979 as the baseline and then say in every year, what is the difference between sort of actual household spending and household spending that we would see if income shares had remained constant at their 1979 level. And you see there are, years in that span where the drag of inequality on demand is like close to 2%, around 1.5%. In some sense, that doesn't, if you don't do a lot of macroeconomics, that doesn't sound huge. Just as a reminder, in 2009 and 2020, we had some of the worst recessions we've seen in the past 60 years, the great financial crisis, the pandemic recession. The decline in GDP in both of those years was about 2 to 2.5%. And so, what doesn't sound like huge declines in GDP growth can cause enormous economic distress. So one question becomes, okay, there's been this inequality going on. There's been a transfer up the income scale to higher saving households. Is it inevitable that that slows even aggregate demand growth? Are there any countervailing mechanisms that could have kicked in to have, replaced that spending that otherwise would have been lost? And there are basically 2 big coping mechanisms from that kind of drag. One is fiscal policy, one is monetary policy. And basically, these coping mechanisms just have not been responding strongly enough to sterilize the effect of this inequality-induced drag on growth. And the fiscal response has mostly not been effective just because it's just not been strong enough. And for a couple of years before the pandemic, it was actually outright negative. And then the monetary policy coping mechanism is just really weak. And it was completely exhausted for more than a decade before the pandemic. And so the fiscal coping mechanism first, this basically shows the dark bar is the percentage point change in each income group's share of total income. And the dark bar is income before taxes and benefits, and the light bar is income after taxes and benefits. And so the difference between those two things you can think of is how much is fiscal policy, taxes and transfers offsetting the rise in market-based inequality. And if you just look at, that very top bar, you see the huge 7.5% increase in the top 1% share of total income. If we're looking at income before taxes and transfers, fiscal policy does reduce it, but it only reduces it by about a fifth. And so it's allowing like 80% of the market-based increase in inequality to basically stick. And so this is sort of this is one sense to say, this is a pretty weak coping mechanism. Most of the rise in inequality has not been offset by anything going on with fiscal policy. Monetary policy, the big offset is basically the Fed can always reduce interest rates to try to spur business investment as household spending starts declining. And you can see in the era of rising inequality sapping household spending on the aggregate demand side, you have seen a very steady reduction in interest rates over that time as part of the coping mechanism there. But you can also see by 2009, we were at zero interest rates, and we stay there for almost a full decade before the pandemic hits. And there's just very little room at this point for very large interest rate cuts to be a very big offset to anything really going on the aggregate demand side. There's a big puzzle in the story. And one is just that if you look at a very common measure of personal savings, the personal savings rate that is generated by the Bureau of Economic Analysis every quarter, that measure is not rising, it's not rising over time as you see this rise in inequality. And, is this a puzzle that can be reconciled? And I think it is. I think there's a number of reasons why this NCPERS personal savings rate is not the right thing to look at to see if this sort of dynamic is going on. One is that some more comprehensive measures of savings, those that include the effect of asset appreciation, sometimes called Haig-Simons measures of savings, they do show a pretty pronounced upward increase in savings. Second thing, a lot of personal savings is actually stock in corporations, and corporations retain earnings. And so you have a lot of savings that is not showing up on personal balance sheets. It's actually showing up in the corporate sector. That's obviously more true for high income individuals who have a lot of corporate equity. And if you include savings by corporations and just make the sort of mental pass through that corporations are owned by people, and that would show up on the personal balance sheets of very rich people if those earnings weren't retained, that solves some of the puzzle. Lots of high-end income is realized capital gains, which is not included in the denominator of NCPERS personal savings. And then finally, this is kind of subtle but important, higher desired savings. So we redistribute income upwards. Households try to save more. That can actually lead to an economy that starts seeing rising unemployment and slower growth. And hence you do not see an increase in realized savings. And so as we redistribute income upward to households that are trying to save more, at the macro level, that desire to save more actually mostly translates into lower income rather than higher savings. And I'll walk through a little bit of all of these. One, this is just a measure of NCPERS personal savings rate that people often point to. And you see here, there is not, between 1979 and like 2007, that looks to be going down, not up in the era of rising inequality, which is the sort of puzzle I alluded to before. This is a measure that I made of sort of Haig-Simons savings rates, which is basically including not just savings out of income, but also the appreciation in wealth of your stock of savings over time. And these measures have seen a pronounced increase in the post-1979 period. And if you think what savings should be measuring is people's ability to pay for things in the future, this measure of savings does show a pretty pronounced uptick. This measure is actually just corporate retained earnings as a percentage of GDP. And you can see since about the mid-1980s, there's been a pretty steady upward rise in this, and it's pretty significant. Lots of that decline you see in the early 80s until 1986 is, a lot of it is due to the big tax reforms taken over that time. Once the effect of that tax reform passes, you start to see just the pile up of savings on corporate balance sheets happening after that. And then this is just a measure of the importance of realized capital gains for overall income. They've become a much more important part of overall income in the period of rising inequality. They've risen significantly from like 4% of income in the 1970s through the 80s to more like 8% of income in more recent business cycle peaks. And if you include this income in the denominator of the personal savings rate, you would actually sort of see, and most of this is, most of this is saved. And so that you could increase personal savings rate. And then finally, this is just the argument that when you have an increase in desired savings, that isn't always able to be realized. And this is just this is a couple people walking through the intuition. Michael Pettis, who's written a lot about global savings gluts, and Paul Krugman, the New York Times columnist and Nobel Prize winner. They do a good job explaining the intuition. Basically, if you have a huge group of people who decide to save a lot more, you might think national savings is going to rise. But if instead the falling consumption resulting from their decision to save more causes the economy to start either fall into a recession or just underperform its potential, you might just see a fall in incomes and savings will fall in lockstep. And so this desired extra savings is not realized because that chain is broken by the fall in income that results. It's sort of the aggregate demand channel that we've been talking about. So that's the past. I think the evidence of the past is that the rise in inequality has had a very pronounced effect through the aggregate demand channel and reduced overall growth. I think in the present, like over the past 3 years or so, ever since the American Rescue Plan was passed, lots of the data signatures of secular stagnation, that sort of shortfall of actual GDP from potential GDP, very low interest rates, low inflation and wage growth, all those have mostly gone away. I think they have been neutralized by the very big fiscal push from the American Rescue Plan. And then the question becomes, is this a permanent end to that problem of secular stagnation and inequality-induced demand drags, or is it just, we bought ourselves a couple years from this big fiscal push? My sense is that lots of what is affecting the present is just very transitory. The COVID-19 fiscal impulse was really large, but we're not doing it every year. The pandemic supply chain disruptions, which actually pushed potential output down, and so made demand have to work less hard to meet actual potential output, that those are largely gone. And the reallocation shock of recent years was really big, but is resolving itself. And so the question is, like, what happens going forward? Are we going to go right back to pre-pandemic times where this sort of inequality-induced drag on aggregate demand growth really does pull down overall growth? Or are we going to be in a new era where this is not something we worry about as much? I would say, there's some obvious things to think about. One is like reduced inequality going forward would help a lot to make this drag go away. There are some promising signs that some margins of inequality have lessened throughout the pandemic. You definitely see within wages, low-wage workers seeing the fastest wage gains. It's unclear how durable that is. I guess I'm a little bit of a pessimist. I'm going to need to see a couple years of post-pandemic, distorted data before I really put a lot of eggs in this basket. But it's happened so far, and it's been great. There's the question of demographics. There's some thought that maybe if you have a larger share of the population that is now retired and they start dis-saving, spending down money they've saved throughout their working lives, that could actually reduce some of the sort of excess savings that is a drag on growth. Not obvious to me that's going to be true. And it also kind of means you're solving the problem of secular stagnation by relying on a shrinking working age population. And there are many reasons why we might not want a shrinking working age population. And so if we did something like allowed a larger flow of immigrants into the US economy, which I think would be good on many levels, then we're going to have to figure out how we solve the secular stagnation problem if we were only relying on the aging of the population to solve it before. And then I think the most hopeful vision of the future that solves the secular stagnation problem and the inequality drag is that if there really is a very big uptick in some other source of demand in the economy, that could solve the problem. And you could argue that the clean energy transition is that kind of positive exogenous shock to demand if we just really have to do a very decades-long push of investment to build a new sort of green renewable energy-based economy that could really buy us out of the problem of secular stagnation, along with progress on climate change. And so that's the really promising path over the next 10 to 12 years. It's not super clear to me that even if we do a lot of clean investment, will that be enough macroeconomically to really pull us out of completely this inequality drag? But it could help a lot, and it would obviously be good for its own reasons. And so mostly there, I would just say, last thoughts, I think it's striking that the same policy regime that led to a large rise in inequality over the past 30 years has also been associated with clearly slower growth. This to me means that equity efficiency trade-offs, they exist somewhere in some places, but I think they're rarer and less binding than often thought. And I would also just say, I think lots of distributionally progressive policy interventions would not just lead to more spread out incomes throughout the economy, it would also affirmatively lead to faster overall growth. And that's especially true if we think the aggregate demand channel is going to bind going forward. So I think there I'm going to stop, and hopefully we can start the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Josh. And thank you, Michael. So we did get the number of questions beforehand, but just to reiterate, given the presentation and what you just learned, we do want audience participation. So please use the Q&A function to submit your question. So one of the first questions we got was, if income inequality is the concern, why the focus on pensions as opposed to higher salaries, for example? Michael, Josh, any thought on why not talk about, hey, let's raise the minimum wage or versus pensions, or the real I guess the real question is, does it have to be one or the other?
Yeah, maybe I could begin. I guess from our perspective, we are watching pension reforms, so-called pension reforms, taking place in last 15, 20 years, and without realizing what the impact of these reforms is. So we're not really focusing on bigger question of income inequality per se, but one of the outcome of these policy actions, like closing the pension plan to new hires, cutting benefits, things like that, they have consequences. So that spills over, and income inequality is sort of the outcome variable. So these things are happening. What's their impact on income? But if we are concerned with income inequality, I think Josh talked about what are things you can actually do. So here there is, I said overarching purpose of our research really is to see what these reforms are doing to income inequality and to the economy itself. So that's why but the questionnaires point is well taken. If our goal is to reduce income inequality, then not only we should preserve pension, but we should also maybe lift the bottom up, increase the minimum wage or things like that, and make the tax system more progressive, things that have been proven to help reduce income inequality. Because we did have once, very low income inequality in this country, and we are doing things that could actually reduce the income inequality. So maybe raising minimum wage is one of those. But
yeah, Josh, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I would say a couple of things. One, I do think it's your last point. It's like there's a mix of things we should do to address this problem. It doesn't have to just be pensions. I will say on the pension side, I mean, there's two aspects to a lot of the changes I think Michael is talking about. One is just like a reduction in compensation to workers is part of what's going on with some of these reforms. And that's just bad because it increases inequality and it reduces spending power. But even for the same amount of money going to like retirement savings, the more of it that comes in the form of like a defined benefit stable one is going to be very good for sort of macro stabilization generally. I mean, if someone has a defined benefit pension and the economy starts to go a little soft, they don't really need to adjust their own savings to sort of meet a target goal around that. And you can definitely, and you see this in the data, like as the unemployment rate starts to rise, you see a lot of people who think I have to save more because I'm a little worried about my sort of job prospects. And that just provides a further destabilization of the economy. Whereas the more of the economy that is like a stable, predictable stream of income, it makes the job of stabilizing the overall economy easier around it. So I think it's not just the amount of money, but the stability of sort of traditional DB pensions are just good macroeconomically.
Great, thank you. This question just came in. It's a little long, so I'm going to try to read it carefully. The question is, just to clarify for savings overall, an increase in savings overall is a drag for economic growth, and at the same time, people in lower income quintiles need to save more, which means there needs to be a shift in savings from the top quintile to the lower quintile. Is that correct?
I mean, I would say that sounds about right to me. I would say it's definitely, and I would say two things. One, from a macro perspective, a rise in savings, the first order effect is all else equal, it will reduce spending. When the economy is working really well, that increase in savings can get translated pretty seamlessly into tangible investment. And so the decline in household spending that accompanies the rise in savings is made up for by increased business investment. And it's supposed to be interest rates that help channel that excess household savings into business investment. If that link is going really well, it doesn't have to depress the economy. I just think over the past 30 years, that link has not been going very well, mostly because interest rates have been buried so low. We've been not able to lower them to absorb that extra household savings. And so that there are cases in which higher savings doesn't have to drag on growth, but it can, and it has for a number of years. But I do think if you just take, if there's a redistribution of money from the top to the bottom, that gives the bottom room to save a lot more without dragging on the overall economy. Because even if the savings rate for the bottom doubles, it is still going to be 1/10 as large as it is for the top 1%, if that's where the money came from.
Right. And maybe the second half of the question, Michael, you can answer. The second half is increasing savings among lower income quintiles may actually lead to growth as it helps stabilize the ups and downs experienced by those consumers. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. And I can relate to, Josh mentioned pension as sometimes being stabilizers. So having the savings, like in slow economic times, pension checks are coming, whereas some people are losing their jobs and their income is declining. So there is a stabilizing effect of pension. Same thing at the low income, if the savings opportunities are there, that could also be more stabilizing, but they have more money to spend to keep the economy going. So I'm not sure if I answer it to the satisfaction of the question, but that's my thinking.
Okay, great. Another question is, and I think you guys answered this, but it bears repeating. How does today's level of income inequality compare to 50 or 100 years ago in the US?
I mean, I'll very broadly characterize it. It's sort of funny. I think relative to 50 years ago, it is extremely high. I mean, basically 50 years ago is roughly mid 1970s, and basically just like the top 1% of income around that time earned about 10% of total national income. Today, it's closer to 20%. So just that top 1% has doubled the share of total national income that they claim. If you compare it to 100 years ago, it's almost exactly the same. I mean, the evolution of American inequality has been there is a huge decline in inequality associated with World War II. But then it remained very stable at a low level of inequality for the next 30 years or so. And then it began rising again quite sharply in the late 1990s.
Maybe we'll end with this last question to you, Michael. You've said various factors impact income inequality. For example, cuts in education, regressive taxation, decline of unions, shift from DB to DC pension plans. Which factor has the most impact on income inequality?
I think it's the tax part. I was impressed by the analysis by Tom Piketty, where he talks about the examples of Sweden and US. So Sweden was very unequal society until the progressive system of taxation, the social democratic efforts, the unions' involvement, they implemented a very progressive tax system, which made the income inequality really, it made a turnaround really for the good. And he talks also about the US, the chart I showed at the end before Josh started speaking. And that's over the past more than 100 years in that chart, which shows the income inequality and the economic growth. But he refers to US from after the Second World War, made their tax system so progressive that it brought the income inequality down until about 1980s or so, when we made again a U-turn the other way. So I think progressive taxation is really important. My own analysis, I said, to, 1 unit increase in the ratio of top and bottom quintiles decreases the median income growth by about 2%. So I was calculating how much that would be for an individual person. And I think between 2020 and 2000 and 2020, those 20 years of analysis, it will be about $9,000 difference in their median income. If it was 68,000, it would have been about 72,000 instead of 68 because of this slowdown and because of this regressive taxation, which we started between those years, continue to go on that path. So I think that's the most important part. And there's evidence that proves that can be done.
Great. Well, we are near the top of the hour. Let me just take a moment to thank you, Michael, and you, Josh, for joining us today and giving us this great information about the impact of income inequality, the various factors that lead to it, and how for us in the public pension space, how it interacts with the reforms of pensions. Lastly, I do want to thank the audience attendees. Thank you so much for joining us on this very important topic. We will be taking a summer hiatus in August, but return with a new set of webinars for our Center for Online Learning in the fall. Thank you, everybody, and have a great summer.
Hey, thank you.